There's a lot we could say about Rebel Moon, right? I don't think it's a good Netflix original project. I think the first part was pretty boring, which was a Child of Fire. And when The Scargiver came out, I thought it was even more boring. But, you know, Zack Snyder had this vision and he pitched it to Lucasfilms. It ended up getting scrapped. And then, you know, years later, beyond years later, he gets it greenlit on Netflix and now it's super popular. It's one of the most highly streamed Netflix projects out there as of right now, part one and part two. Let's look at some numbers really quick and kind of dive in a little bit more as to why this is successful somehow. So looking at Rebel Moon Part 1 Child of Fire, 21% of the critics recommend that you go watch this film, and 57% of the audience recommends that you go watch this film. A little over half the audience thinks that the film is good, and a lot less of the critics definitely think that, you know, hey, you got to give it a chance. I'll be honest, when I first saw the trailers of this, I was like, damn, this actually could be really good. But Zack Snyder has a track record of making really great cinematography, eye candy looking films, but the story is just really trash and it's very over exaggerated in some parts of his film. Watchmen, the very beginning of that is completely long. Army of the Dead, the very beginning of that is just completely long and a bunch of slow mo shots. And you know, I think Zack Snyder's best film is 300. So with him coming out with Rebel Moon, the very first part here wasn't really too loved by the critics, and just a little bit over half the audience loved it. But let's go into part two and see if there's a difference. Rebel Moon Part 2 The Scargiver. 16% of the critics recommend that you go watch this film. A little bit lower than the last one, but hey, both are under 25% of the critics recommending that you go watch this film. We move on into the audience, and 50% exactly recommend that you go watch this film. Half the audience did not like it, and half the audience recommends that you go watch it. I will say that The Scargiver, I was being a little bit optimistic. I was like, you know what? The first Rebel Moon part wasn't that great. It was a little bit boring. It was very slow paced, but that's just how Zack Snyder is in a lot of his movies. It's just a very slow paced, over exaggerated story. For this right here, I was like, maybe part two fixes some things that part one just didn't get right. And we can start to maybe look at something that's a little bit better than what we've gotten before. I will say I was completely wrong. The project had good action, but it just was very slow at the same time. There was like bits and pieces where I was like, oh, this is a very fun watch, but at the same time, you're just sitting there and you're just bored. I was just bored the whole time. But, you know, I watched part one and two for a reason. And honestly, when part three comes out, I'm going to watch it too, because I really want to see this through. So with part one coming out in 2023 and part two coming out in 2024, I kind of was thinking to myself, well, how much did Netflix give Zack Snyder? What was the budget for this? And, you know, that was my next kind of thought. According to Forbes, the budget for Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2 was reportedly around 166 million, which is actually surprisingly low compared to other films in its genre. Now, Rebel Moon has, you know, it's dealing with space and, you know, there's going to be a whole bunch of CGI stuff. Wow, I butchered that word. CGI things going on, and you know, you're gonna need a lot of money if you want to make something that involves, you know, aliens in space and shooting the blasters and stuff like that. You're gonna want to make it look really good, so it's gonna cost you a lot of money. But 166 million for part 1 and 2 is surprisingly low. For Netflix giving this $166 million, you know, it seems a lot because it's just a streaming platform. It's not like the big movie production companies like Warner Brothers or Marvel or stuff like that, who they throw out 150 mil and you're just like, that's not really a lot for them. But for Netflix, that's quite a bit of money. For the people that did not find Rebel Moon Part 2 or Rebel Moon Part 1 interesting at all, you would think in your mind, well, since these audience and critic scores kind of suck, that means that this show isn't really that good. It's probably not as popular as we think. Boy, if you think that, well, you're completely wrong. And I thought that too, and I was completely wrong. So I looked up what's the most popular Netflix originals that are out in 2024. And if we look down the list right here next to me, we have Rebel Moon. Wow. For us to further dive into these numbers and these streaming, clicks and stuff like that, we're looking at this number of weeks in Netflix global top tens is 6 weeks. The total number of hours is 191 million. That's insane. December 17th, when part one came out, was 54 million hours and 24 million views basically around here. And then they just keep going up. They just keep going up and they keep going up all the way until April 21st to April 28th. I mean, these were above 10 million, right? And for two of these right here, it was above 50 million. Now, if we move on into part two's numbers right here, it says number of weeks in Netflix's global top 10 was 3 weeks, 95 million hours of it being streamed. And, these are the numbers throughout here. So, I mean, it's getting a lot of attention. It's getting a lot of views here. And this is how many hours it's been streamed in Netflix's top 10, 95 million. And then for part one, 191 million, almost a quarter of a billion hours. For part one, and almost 100 million hours for part two, and part two has been out less than part one. Combined in total, they're over a quarter of a billion hours streamed on here. That is freaking ridiculous, and they only have 2 parts. It's not like this is a show where there's like 20 episodes or 12 episodes that can kind of accumulate and get to that over a quarter of a billion hours streamed. The only thing that kind of intrigues me a little bit is that why are so many people watching this? Why are we so intrigued? Why do we want to take the time to watch Rebel Moon? If we think it is so boring, if we think that it's not that good of a film, why are over a quarter of a billion hours being watched on both part one and part two combined? And that's an answer that I don't have. I'm just a guy who does videos on YouTube and talks about this type of topic. I don't have the answers. If you look what's happening as of recent right now with Rebel Moon Part 2, Rebel Moon Part 2 suffered a 68% drop in viewing hours in its full second week on Netflix, lagging behind the first movie. At the end of the day, if you're like looking at a project that isn't really loved by a lot of audience and critics, and it's still getting over a quarter of a billion hours watched, so there's something being done right. And the thing is, that's the answer that we need to find out. And that's why I want to ask you guys, if you're tuning into the video, leave a comment down below on why you think Rebel Moon is, as successful as it is, for it being a very type of movie. At least to me, my opinion is my opinion. I really want to know your guys' opinion. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you feel in between? What do you know? What are your thoughts of Rebel Moon? Apparently, Zack Snyder has his own Snyder Cut for him releasing the rated R version of, the Rebel Moon parts. So that way it kind of fixes the things that, people thought were terrible about the movie. And I don't know why he has to make a whole different director's cut for Rebel Moon. Why didn't you do it right the first time? That's just how he rolls. That's just what's going to happen. And that just is what it is. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave your comment down below. Your honest thoughts, your honest opinions. What do you think about all this? If you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button. We're almost at 1 million subscribers. No, we're not. But thank you guys for giving all the love in the last video. It's already at 100,000 views. No, it's not. And, continue to support the channel if you're already subscribed, and continue watching the videos if you're already subscribed. If you want to be like those people and you're not already subscribed, subscribe.